So we are going to basically start from the very beginning of neural networks. This might be review for some people, but we want to get everybody up to like a basic level of knowledge. Otherwise, you will be quite lost for the remainder of the week. We're going to go through this quite fast. This is like 65 slides for 60 minutes. These slides will go up at the end of the day. So there's a couple things we will skirt right past, but you can review them on your own time. Cool. So what is a neural network? The simplest high-level overview, it's a machine learning model. It's formed of interconnected layers of nodes. The nodes are called neurons, and they're called neurons because they're designed to mimic the function of real neurons that are in our brains. So we're going to start at the level of the neuron and build all the way on up. But first, we're going to go through two quick side things. First, two types of learning that are possible. There is supervised learning, where the network needs to get a set of labeled training data. So if you want to train an image classifier to recognize pictures of dogs, you need to give it a lot of pictures labeled dog. There's also unsupervised learning, where the network doesn't get labeled training data, and then the goal is just to identify inherent patterns in the data. One of the most common examples of that would be clustering. So like k-means clustering, there are pretty obvious clusters in that data, and you ask a program to find them. This talk is going to focus on supervised learning, so methods that require labeled training data. The other two things, you can do two types of things with a network. You can do classification or regression. You might see those terms. Classification just means the output is categorical. For example, computer vision, you want to recognize a digit. What it outputs is the label. It identifies it as 0 to 9 or a letter A to Z, versus regression, where the output is numerical, like find me this equation, you want it to give you a number. Okay, neurons. So let's start, because we're basing it on biological neurons, with what a neuron is and does. So basically, a neuron has dendrites, which receive signals from other neurons in your brain. And then depending on what those signals are, it's either going to fire off a little electrical signal down its axon antenna, or it's not. So what is a neuron? It's a cell that takes a combination of inputs and decides what output to produce, which in this case is either send a signal or don't send a signal. And how does that become a computer neuron? So the simplest type of neuron is a binary linear neuron, which given a set of inputs can output either, say, 0 or 1. For the purpose of this PowerPoint visually, we're going to represent inputs as triangles and diamonds. In reality, they would be numerical objects. So let's all pretend that I found a meaningful way to represent a triangle as a vector of numbers. So basically, what can this neuron do? It's going to take an input, and depending on what it is, it's going to decide what output to produce. And because there are only two possible outputs, the only thing this neuron can do is put those triangles and diamonds into one of two groups, ideally correctly. So how do we do that classifying process? It's a computer, so we do it through the language of math. So the neuron, what that triangle would actually be, is a vector of numbers. And then the neuron has a vector of weights. So we take the inputs and the weights, dot them together, take the dot product. That gives us a single number called net input function. And then we compare the net input function to threshold. So basically, if the net input function is greater than the threshold, it outputs 1, and we go into one group. It's less than the threshold, we output 0, we go and the other threshold. You might also see in the literature the term bias. Bias basically means we did some algebra, we moved the threshold around, we put it in, and that makes it trainable with one of the weights. So basically just moving it over to the other side of the equation. So now that we have weights and a bias, and we need this network to do a good job, we need to train it. And what is training? It is the process of updating weights and bias to improve the performance of the model which we do iteratively. So to start with, we need training data, which consists of labeled examples. So basically we have one set of vectors and a corresponding set of tags that tells you if it's a triangle or a diamond. And then all of our triangles and diamonds go through the neural network, and what comes out the end? A label, because the only thing this binary linear neuron can do is put one of two labels on it. So then do the training. If the label is correct, do nothing, don't change the weights. If the label is wrong, change the weights. Because I have a feeling we are already behind time. We're going to skip this math. You can look at it at your own time, but basically just move the weights to improve the performance. And vocabulary you'll probably see in the field of neural networks is training epochs. An epoch just means one run through all of the data in the training set. If you have 1,000 examples, in every epoch you go through every 1,000, and then you start over. A batch, for large training data sets, you usually process it in a smaller subset, note it's a batch, and then you would update the weights after you run through each batch. And then there's the learning rate, which controls how quickly you update the weights and bias as you are training. So, binary linear neuron only outputs 0 or 1. There's a big problem here. If we look at our equation for when the decision point of when we output 0 and when we output 1, and we do some algebra again, we get a linear equation. We can only make a decision line, which means we can only do problems with this neuron that are linearly separable. And most problems are not linearly separable, which is why we had to move from simple perceptrons and binary linear neurons to more complicated architectures. So to add more complexity, what do? We can move to the adaline, the adaptive linear neuron, which is almost like the simple binary linear neuron, but now it has an activation function, which basically means the net input goes into the activation function, and the activation function chooses what comes out. In this case, the activation function is linear or identity, so whatever number goes in comes back out. That might seem small, but that is kind of a fundamental change. Okay, actually, sorry. Slide order. We're going to do more about what activation functions are. So, like I said, the activation function just picks what the output is based on the input. This is a very common one called ReLU, which is rectified linear unit. So if the input is negative, the output is 0. If the input is greater than 0, the output is the input. Activation functions introduce nonlinearity to neural networks. Otherwise, even a deep network with multiple layers could only do those linearly separable problems. So this allows the decision surface basically to be curved. So there's different kinds of activation functions, which depending on what your neural network needs to do, you would choose between. ReLU is common for regression versus if you are doing probability, the sigmoid is between 0 and 1. So obviously, if you have a probability and it's less than 0 or greater than 1, that's a problem. So basically, the choice of activation is going to be dictated in a sense by what you're doing and what you need the network to do. So back to my original point, what does an activation function allow us to do? When we were training our original binary linear neuron, we just compared the predicted class label to the true class label, and it could only be correct or wrong. But now we compare the activation, which is continuous, it can be any number, to the target. And that means we can now be different quantities of wrong. So if the star is the prediction, is the true label, and our network predicts just a little bit over there, it's a little wrong, but it could also be way over here, so it's a lot wrong. So now we have a quantifiable amount of error, and the way to train this network is to make that quantifiable amount as small as possible. So the first thing we need to do is actually quantify it. So we do that through something called a loss function. This is mean squared error, which you are probably familiar with from math. It's very common for regression problems. So say if I want the model to predict the x coordinate of something, it's just real x coordinate, predicted x coordinate, mean square. And that allows us to move towards the true value. There will be different errors for classification versus regression. So loss functions quantify error, and training is going to occur by minimizing that loss. How do we do that? Do something called gradient descent, which I will first explain analogously. Now that we have a loss function, we have a loss surface, which you can think about like a topographical map. And we want to go to the smallest amount of error, which is the lowest elevation on that surface. We're starting on a hill. We want to reach the valley. How do you do that? Just keep walking downhill. So we need to know the slope of the loss surface. To do that, we will start at an arbitrary position, and we will use the learning rule. And again, we will slide past math in the name of time. But basically, you are taking a partial derivative and a tangent, and that's giving you a direction and an amount to step, and just step, step, step down to the minimum. And again, we have this learning rate eta, which determines how large each step is, how big is that weight update. So eta here takes on some extra significance because we are no longer guaranteed to converge. If eta is too big, too small, it could take a very long time to converge, or if you have, say, a little valley next to your big valley, you can get stuck in a local min, but if it's too big, you can overshoot and bounce around. So the role of learning rate is important. In real networks, you will see sometimes learning rates that decrease with time or decrease on plateau, so various things that are done to help it find the global minimum. So now we have done neurons, and we need to build up to a network. So how do we do that? You just take layers of neurons and put them together. The simplest architecture that you will encounter is the fully connected network. That means every neuron feeds into every neuron in the next layer. So basically, layer one, the input, shoots out outputs that then become inputs to the next layer, and so on, like neurons in your brain talking to each other. The layers in the middle are known as hidden layers. So the number of nodes per layer and the connectivity is going to vary depending on what the network is and what it's for. How deep it is, how big it needs to be is very problem dependent. To train a multi-layer network, we need to update the weight and bias for all of the layers all the way through. So to do that, you use a technique which is known as backpropagation, which happens in two passes. So a forward pass is feed training data in at the front, propagate it through all of the layers, get a prediction out, get a loss. And now you do a backwards pass where, using the chain rule, you determine the loss for all the neurons, you update the weights and bias, back, and then again, you just train iteratively by going through all of your training data. Once you have trained a network, you need to evaluate the performance, which can be done using several metrics: accuracy, precision, recall. Now, there are many types of neural networks: the multi-layer perceptron, the convolutional neural network, physics-informed network, etc. How do you know which one to use? How do you build it? And the answer basically is you take a problem-centric approach. So you always start with the problem at hand. You analyze the nature of the input data and the desired output, and you choose a network data that aligns with the type of structure in your data. You'll also select a loss function that will be different based on whether you're doing regression or classification, and metrics. So this was originally just a convolutional neural networks for imaging task. So we're going to go through that problem-centric approach for one specific problem. Let's say, hypothetically, you have a lot of photos of your family pets, and you'd like to make a neural network that will classify them into dogs or cats. What will we do? If we look anywhere in the literature at image classification tasks, we will see that what people are using for this type of problem is called a convolutional neural network, which is a specialized type of network designed for processing image data. You typically see them 2D for images. I will note that there's also 1D variants, which are good if you have, say, audio or other signals in time, signals in frequency. And the good thing about convolutional neural networks is because of the way they work, you can process data spatially and look at the different features in different parts of an image, whereas a dense neural network flattens everything into a vector, feeds it in. So we need to look at all of our pictures of my dog. How do we turn my dog into data? A picture is going to be represented as an array of value. An RGB image has 3 channels, so 3 2D matrices for the red, the green, blue channel. And this cell phone photo has roughly 3,000 by 4,000 pixels, which means it has 51 million. It's really big. It's really big is the point. So why is that important? If we wanted to look at this with one of those fully connected networks that we just saw, the logical way to do it would be to have every neuron listen to every pixel. And if every neuron listens to every pixel, then the network needs 51 million weights for RGB, 17 million weights for single channel. Even if we make more reasonably sized input images, it's really, really inefficient to process images with dense networks. That's one of the reasons that convolutional neural networks got started. They're much more parameter efficient for processing images than are dense networks. Even so, deep convolutional neural networks, deep just means multiple layers, hidden layers in the middle. They typically are going to use some form of downsampling or pooling to make things smaller, just because you have a lot of parameters going on. So if you look at the structure of a DCNN from literature, and really any DCNN, it's going to be made of 3 types of layers: convolution layers, pooling layers, and fully connected or dense layers. So now we will go through what those are and how we put one of these things together. Convolution. What is a convolutional layer? It has a number of filters, also known as kernels. A filter is a smaller matrix, and they're used to detect specific patterns in the input data, and they do feature extractions. With kernels, each neuron is only listening to a part of the image. It doesn't need to take input from every single pixel, so it doesn't need as many weights. That's one of the benefits. How do we do this? How does filtering work? So convolution operates on 2 images, because remember that kernel matrix is itself an image is a matrix. One input is the image, the second acts as a filter. The kernel is smaller than the total image size. It's going to slide across the image, analyzing one region at a time. We take the image matrix, we multiply it by the kernel matrix, which forms an output, which is in turn another matrix. And then it's going to move by a step size known as the stride. There are different types of kernels that you could have if you wanted to do different tasks like sharpening or blurring or edge detection. So as an example, we have a 6x6 input image. We have a couple of filters. Basically, a filter learns patterns that looks like the filter. Our diagonal ones filter looks for diagonal ones. Our vertical ones filter looks for vertical ones. So they're going to slide across and basically determine where and how much are these patterns present. So filter starts in the corner. it dots with that green region of input image, makes an output, stride of 1, slide over 1, dot with that input region of image, get an output. We do that a bunch, we build a new little image. What about color? It basically means we have 3 channels, so we have to do that 3 times, which is another reason why these things get so big. And like I said, this is just a visual representation of the concept of stride, which is how much the filter moves over. For a stride of 1, you just move over 1. For bigger strides, you move over more. Bigger strides are typically used to downsample. Basically, you get smaller output because you are doing fewer steps, because again, keeping these things reasonably sized is important. So again, because of the filter process, we have fewer parameters because we are listening to not the entire image at once. And we also have shared weights, which are good for representing spatially connected features. So what does it look like when we do a round of convolution? This is for MNIST, which is a training database of just handwritten digits 0 to 9. So we do the first convolution and get a bunch of identified features, which look digity. The next thing we have in these networks are pooling layers. So pooling is a downsampling process. It makes the image smaller so the network can learn fewer parameters. And the way to do that is you divide the image into non-overlapping regions. And for each of those regions, you make a new pixel. For max pooling, you pick whatever the max value is and that goes over. For average pooling, whatever the average values is. So like visually, divide it into 4. Each pixel region contributes 1 pixel to the output image. For the max pool, it's the biggest one. For the average pool, it's the average. Max pooling is pretty common. So when you pool, you have fewer pixels and less data, but it is still the same thing. So just to prove it to you, I downsampled this photo 4 times and it's still of my dog. So assembling the convolutional neural network. To move through the layers, we convolve an image with a kernel, generate a new image. For each convolutional layer, the number of output channels is equal to the number of filters used, 10 filters, 10 output channels. That's called the depth. Pooling is going to make the channel smaller, but it doesn't change the depth. A deep convolutional neural network typically consists of alternating convolution and pooling layers, typically a couple of these with different filter sizes and number of filters. Then you flatten and you go into some number of layers of dense network, and at the end, you get your prediction. So what does flattening do? Basically, you take your multidimensional data and it becomes a vector to go into a dense network that expects a vector. To train, convolutional neural networks typically want or need really large training sets, which if you're like Meta AI and you have the internet is easy. But for a lot of experimenters, you have your experimental images that you generated and you might not have a ton. So one of the things that you can consider is data augmentation, which basically means do transformations to the images that change them, but it's still the same thing. Like rotating my dog, she's still my dog. That is PowerPoint's best attempt at Gaussian noise. So adding noise to imaging, rotating, resizing, cropping. You can make a data set bigger by doing all these variants. Also, these things typically need to be trained on 1 or more GPUs for speed. So this thing is going to be hefty. Practical implementation. So there are, that I know of, 2 frameworks that you will typically see in the literature. The first is TensorFlow. I learned on TensorFlow. I would say it's good because it's easy to learn. At the core, TensorFlow can make sequential models by just stacking the layers like you see in that code snippet. So basically, if you can make a drawing of it on paper, TensorFlow makes it really easy to realize it in code. With the API, there's a lot of stuff it can do at a high level without having to do a lot of math stuff. I recently encountered a con. It does not appear to like running on GPUs on Windows. It will do it on Colab. If you put it on a Windows desktop and say, hello, I have a GPU, please train on it. There's also PyTorch. Some of the pros of PyTorch, it's quite common in research. A lot of papers, if they're giving you code, they're giving it to you in PyTorch. So it's good to be fluent with this one. It's powerful when you know how to use it. I think it's a slightly higher barrier to entry. Instead of just our simple stack, the neural network is written as an actual class with a forward method. The glorious thing about the age of LLMs is that they can make both of these for you, and then you just have to figure out what they're doing. And this is just a summary of the different types of layers. And depending on how fast I talked, we're either over time or this was only 20 minutes, and I'll know in a moment. Thank you. Oh, it was. We're under time. Wow. So questions?
You mentioned that downsampling does not affect the output, but like if we are losing some information that, like, if there are ways to recognize that, or we are able to with they have to figure it out.
Generally, like I showed, the typical architecture is convolution and then pool, and convolution and then pool. So you are doing a pool at each step, just to keep the numbers down. I thought it was going to be too long. It was 2 hours.
Hi, I have a question. So can you put your slide in the GitHub? We can learn after this.
Yes, I will make a pull request right now with.
Thank you.
One of you read it? I stuck in my chair.
The question is, if you want to use a GPU, but you're not too versed in Python, is PyTorch the only option to use?
No, if you have Google Colab, I have a TensorFlow neural network that trains on a Colab CPU, and I didn't have to mess with it. So you might have to pay for Colab Pro, but Colab will be.
Also, we will have a hackathon in that notebook. There will be a Torch network that we're using. So it's a little bit more complicated, but we tried to break it down. So should be able to handle it. Again, that's something in chat. You can look at the chat here. So we have to read it.
Yep. So TensorFlow and GPUs will try to get that. But
yep.
Any other questions? Otherwise, we have a longish break here. Okay. You were rattling through it quite quickly here. It is certainly more than one can easily digest. And I think that's mostly the reason why people wanted to see the slides online so that they can follow along. Yeah. Good. Yeah. Any general questions? Well, we have good time. Don't run away. So,
So as I understand it, for a standard neural network, it only knows, oh, did I take it off? One moment. It only knows about the data that you give it. So if you tell it to like learn to regress a function between here, and then you ask it about over here, it gives you nonsense. A physics-informed neural network has a data loss and then a physics loss, which is usually based on an equation. If you know it should look like some functional form, the idea is match this data and also it should be X curve or X equation. I think it's used a lot in like fluid dynamics, where you know based on the physics, it should look like this thing. It's kind of, you have now two losses. So you have a loss that's like, how well did you do on matching the data and how much did you be the equational form that I know you should be. So, yeah.
generally, maybe for the whole workshop, any feedback that we can have? Should we change anything in the format? It's a little late for us because we already have, of course, our program, but if you need more time in between, or maybe better tomorrow morning, we may just see how many people are still here. It's a direct measure of success, I guess. Yeah, well, we keep you here, we feed you. Obviously. Well, thank you, Elizabeth. And there's something more in the chat. Okay. Elizabeth says still something for you, a GAN model, GAN. Yeah. Okay. Somebody was slow. Hackathons always come with pizza. What you're talking about? I mean, how can you do it without it? No. Yeah,
that's going to be a survey.
Okay, I think this one is a more advanced question, which we will do. Will be answered by Sergey, so we need a little bit more background. I didn't come up with an easy explanation either, so yeah. So that needs some more background. We'll handle it so, Arisu. So we'll get that. Okay.
Yeah, basically two neural networks going there.
Yes.
Yeah, there is more to that, so because the math gets complicated then suddenly. Yeah.